trying to protect their businesses from any contingency. Once again, I repeat, this is an unedited videotape, but we did manage to get hold of this tape to give you an idea of some of the individual actions that are being taken. These they do not look like automatic, like AK-47s. They seem to be regular rifles that they're using.
But it seems like every man on that roof was armed.
Yeah, that's right. And thus far, there does not seem to be any looting or burning, at least right where they are.
I think
now that man up there seems to be holding a shotgun, Larry, if I'm not mistaken.
I think he's holding a shotgun, and I think one of his purposes is he wants potential looters to see it. I think he wants people, all of them up there, want people to see that they are armed and that you enter their properties at some risk.
Well, you notice this is in a high-rise area. I'm not exactly sure where that is. I suspect that is just south of Vermont.
Yes, that's the area it looks like. I saw a sign, a street sign that said 5th Street, too, a moment ago.
Okay.
There are a lot of armed people over there.
We certainly have all the ingredients for confrontation.
Yes. I just heard somebody in the group there on the audio portion of the videotape said they're coming. I don't know what that means, whether they are preparing for somebody whom they see who may be arriving to do something to them. But it certainly seems that they are preparing for some kind of confrontation. Or perhaps they were referring to law enforcement that were coming. Something
Larry,
is about to happen there.
I've just been informed that the Korean language newspaper says that 100 businesses have been hit in Korean-owned businesses in the area.
We are with you.
At that time, I was in the gun store. Then I have received a phone call from my employer. His name is Richard Park. He also owned the jewelry store right down the block there. And he said, David, we're having a gunfighting here. So can you just come over and help us? We already called police. And when I arrived here, at the beginning, I can see the LAPD, the vehicle with like 3-4 officers were there. So, oh, we have a police here, we are safe. But as soon as the gunfighting started, they ran away. Bye. So, we are on our own. Then what I saw from across the street is a lot of looters were armed, heavily armed, and they're shooting at us. My experience was, whoever actually attacked and looting the Koreatown was not African Americans. It was more likely Hispanic cholos or gangbangers. Bullet was coming to my face here and there, so I thought I'm going to get shot. So, naturally, I just trying to protect my face, my hands like this momentarily. Then I was thinking, oh, wait a minute, what am I doing? So I just, put it down. Whoever actually I saw having guns, I didn't hesitate to shoot them. Otherwise, I could have got shot. Some of them are popping up from there and there with their shotgun and handguns. In retrospect, it's a dangerous moment. And I was scared. But even though you're scared, you don't have much option. You have to fight. Korean people are very frustrated. Koreatown was damaged and destroyed.
Why are we the victims? My parents are good Christians. We've been through so much, and to go through this, everything, 22 years down the drain.
Many Koreans who yesterday were the shopkeepers of South Central Los Angeles today have lost the businesses they took years to create.
What can I say? I don't have any word to say. This looks a comeback, John.
George Huang woke this morning to find his mini mall burnt to the ground. A loss of $1.5 million and a lifetime of dreams and effort.
I don't mind that. Whatever they need, take it out. But why they burn out the property? That's my question.
41 Korean businesses in South Central have been torched, dozens looted. In this overwhelmingly black and Hispanic area, Koreans own many of the small businesses. They're insular, they employ their own, they keep to themselves. Blacks say that's the problem.
I'm not surprised that the Koreans got targeted because their prices are high, their attitude is wrong, and they just don't seem to have any respect for the black community.
You know how it all started? The first thing when a girl got killed from the Oriental.
March 16th, 1991. Latasha Harlins, a black teenager, is shot and killed by a Korean store owner, Sunja-do. Do is convicted of voluntary manslaughter, but is sentenced only to parole and a small fine. The black community is outraged and remembers.
What, 6 months probation? I mean, the people were pissed then.
Today, local Korean radio is broadcasting which stores in the area are threatened. Young men like Eddie Kim rush over to try to defend them.
I don't care about the racism, I don't care anything, but it's not right, okay? It's not right to break inside and get any stuff, you know? It's not right. I don't think it's right.
Hee Lee spent last night and will spend tonight guarding his appliance store. A small battalion of employees and relatives will try to help.
I only have one shotgun. That's all I have. What do they have? They have hundreds of crazy people, hundreds of crazy young people with lots of guns.
After the destruction, many Koreans have lost all faith that the authorities can protect them.
Well, we hope police can protect, but as you see, this shortage of manpower, police.
Koreans have fanned out across South Central, worried that tonight, with so little left to loot, more of their stores will burn. But even in the midst of the chaos, John Wee is rebuilding.
We will continue to serve this community by doing the proper way of business. I don't think this is the will of the majority of this community.
This was one of the most exciting stories that I've covered in my more than 3 decades of journalism.
The most common question I heard from Korean Americans is, why us? Why Korean Americans? Why are we being targeted?
We knew we had to fight to have our stories be told. In April of 1992, I was a Metro reporter for the Los Angeles Times. I covered Los Angeles County government. However, since we knew the verdict was coming in, I was brought in to help out with the reporting on the night of the verdict.
I was a reporter at the Orange County edition of the LA Times, so I was pretty much a suburban reporter, really trying to get downtown to the big headquarters in Los Angeles, and not having a lot of success doing that.
I was sitting on the 3rd floor of the LA Times headquarters in downtown, and I was writing a story, and I saw the verdict.
The jury in the Rodney King case has delivered its verdict, and the 4 police officers, they've all been found not guilty.
I was stunned, like I think the entire newsroom was, and I remember thinking, this is really gonna be awful. You could just feel that the whole situation was gonna explode. And then on the television monitors in the newsroom, we saw the first helicopter shots of Florence, Normandy.
Did you see it, Dave? 2 people dragged from cars in this intersection.
The reporter I was with drove to that section of the city, and she's a white woman with a white photographer, and they stoned her car. The newsroom, when I arrived there in the late 80s, it was very homogeneous white male. And so the newsroom was trying to diversify. And so they hired me and a bunch of other people in these diversity programs.
There had been a lot of pressure on the LA Times to hire a Korean American reporter that would cover local news because of the large Korean community in Los Angeles.
We reporters of color were united in our disdain for the management structure of the Los Angeles Times. You know, we knew we had to fight to have our stories be told.
There were a very small handful of Asians, blacks, and Latinos hired at that time. And we were all working in these very far-flung suburbs. It was at about that time that the riots broke out.
When you disagree with that verdict, as I did, express that rage and frustration, but don't take it out by looting, burning, and by shooting people.
There was then a call put out for people of color who were in the suburbs to come and participate in the coverage of the riots.
A lot of us reporters of color were sent out to do this street reporting. And I think it's a really natural tendency of a person in charge as an editor to say, let's send someone who's less likely to get beaten up. See, by the second day, we had seen this video of Reginald Denny, this white trucker being beaten up on the streets.
I know some of the black journalists were very upset about this because they felt that we basically never get to cover any other stories, but now that the riots are here, you want to send out these young reporters as cannon fodder. In my case, I volunteered to work because I lived in LA. This was my city that was going to hell in a handbasket.
I drove up and down the riot zone, and I remember I was in Koreatown. I must have been on Olympic, and I just saw how the riot had spread to this part of the city, and I remember calling in and saying, Koreatown is burning. Did you know that?
So on that day, I would have been in the middle of the street because there was no, there were crowds filling the street here. There was no traffic really. And there was a huge crowd that was looting that market over there. This building here was on fire. And I could see the aisles of the store, and I could see crowds of mostly Latino people running up and down the aisles, taking things, grabbing things, people running out with gallon jugs of milk.
And it was exhilarating at first because you were seeing all of this pent-up anger in the city. You were seeing these decades of crises that had finally built up to a moment when the whole status quo exploded. And as a person of color, as a person committed to social change, I thought, finally, this hit the fan. Thank God.
Looters go on a rampage.
After about 1 or 2 hours of seeing people getting beat up on the streets and seeing the sort of randomness of it, you realize that you were in a situation where it was rule of the strongest. It wasn't that amusing anymore. It was really scary.
근데 우리는 거기다 목매달고 있는데 우리 어떻게 하면 좋아요? 우리가 어떻게 파이어 보험을 안 들었어요, 인슈런스를.
There were Korean businesses that were being hit in South Los Angeles and as far south as Long Beach.
There was actually a curfew at that time, and you were not supposed to be out on the street. And everyone else had gone to bed. And John and I were like, the city is burning to the ground. How can we be reporters and we're just gonna go to bed? So we decided then that we would team up and go out to Koreatown. I was scared out of my wits because the whole narrative at that time was that Blacks and Latinos were going to these different businesses and burning them, which is why Korean merchants were armed trying to protect their businesses from looters. That was a crazy night. There were no police anywhere, sirens everywhere, fires everywhere. We went riding through Koreatown, and we pulled up to this strip mall, and there were all these people who were armed, you know, to the teeth with rifles, and they were dropped down behind what I thought at the time were sandbags.
I'm not sure I might have gone out again. When we pulled up and were met with like the 21 gun salute, I realized, oh, Tammy's African-American and I look dark. So these guys they think they're being attacked.
Yeah. I mean, did you think at first we were really like maybe had made a mistake coming out here? Well, when you saw all those guns?
And I wasn't sure how they were going to respond to, like, we're reporters from the Times. Because the Times was not universally embraced by Koreans at that time.
We pulled up here, and there were probably about a dozen men crouched down on their knees behind what looked like sandbags, but they were rice bags.
And that was the first time that I really started thinking about, like, okay, so who are the shooters?
Here we were, these two young reporters, and we're kind of riding around the city trying to make sense of this huge story. And we're all just so young and fresh in our careers and, with very little guidance, really. And I remember trying to sort of, even in spite of all the chaos, put some of this in perspective. And with all the focus on why are all these people burning their own neighborhoods, step back and say, yes, the riots are a story, but let's remember, why are people rioting? What was the lead up to this? The lead up to this was that there were, 5 police shootings in 1 month. It wasn't just Rodney King. It was the feeling that this had been allowed to continue and continue and continue.
I was out driving around, I was interviewing people, I was capturing impressions of what was happening, and I'd call back into the newsroom to a catcher. And the catcher would feed the notes to the writer, and the writers would go through and they would pull out our quotes. So I was actually one person removed from the person even writing the story.
What happened was, very few of the people of color were the ones doing the actual writing of any of these stories.
It really is actually extremely frustrating, somewhat humiliating, to be someone risking your life for a story and not being able to tell it.
At the LA Times, we were monitoring the local television showing the smoke coming out of the city. And one of the shots showed Koreatown, so that's when I told the desk that I'm heading to Koreatown. There were a bunch of people gathered at the Western and Fifth to guard the supermarket with guns, trying to prevent the rioters from approaching their building and torch their place. So I hunkered down with them. There were no cops coming to protect any of the shops. Had I not been a photojournalist with the LA Times, I might have been out there that night guarding some of the shops.
That image of the armed Korean merchant protecting their business is the lasting image and one of the only images that survived the riots. I feel that's what the mainstream media was able to afford Koreans as far as characterization. I feel responsible in that I worked for one of the agencies that was publishing those stories. I may not have written the stories, but I was working at that newspaper that was publishing stories that characterize Korean and African Americans as adversarial. An industrious reporter can go out and find enough people to support an article which will say, blacks don't like Koreans. And you can find a merchant who says, I'm Korean and I don't like blacks. And if you amplify that with maybe half a dozen interviews, it looks like you have a pretty substantial story. But that ignores the fact that there may be 300,000 Korean Americans who say, blacks and Koreans have a lot in common. Once a story is kind of coined, the news editors are looking for the elements of that story to reoccur.
And I was very excited because, I had already established myself as one of the newspaper's strongest feature writers. I'm a person of color. I knew South Los Angeles. I felt like I understood what had led to this moment. And what I was asked to do instead was to go out and find looters. Hector, you go out and see if you can find some looters for us, Latino looters for us, because we saw a lot of Latinos looting in the riots on television. Go see if you can find some. And I was so personally insulted. I decided that I would never allow that to happen to me again, and eventually I wrote a novel about Los Angeles. The central truth was about LA's diversity and LA's history and LA's complexity. This just wasn't making it into the newspaper every day because the actual form of storytelling in the newspaper didn't allow this full truth to be told.
Shortly after the riots, I had decided to leave mainstream journalism or the LA Times, being in the position of having to define what role did Koreans play in the riots. And I feel that there was not room for Korean American story, I guess, to be fully told. It just was not to the benefit of Korean Americans. And that was kind of why I was hired.
Any story that had anything to do with the black person, they would say, oh, Tammy, where's Tammy Drummond? And I really resented it. But after the riots, I began to feel that, wait a minute, you know, I need to be telling some of these kinds of stories, because if I'm not going to tell them, you know, who is? This is the plaque that all of the staff members were given. Pulitzer Prize for 1992 Los Angeles Times coverage of the LA riots. After the paper won this Pulitzer Prize, it became, you know, more difficult to convince anyone, the editors at least at the paper, that there had been any deficiencies in the coverage, because they'd obviously been awarded, you know, journalism's top honor. I have conflicted feelings about it. I mean, like I say, for some of the reporting, I mean, we did, I think, an excellent job in terms of, you know, basic factual spot news information. But in terms of explaining why these disturbances happened, I think we could have, you know, done a much better job.
Today, this day that seems very ordinary, very orderly, and that day of chaos and anger and rage of 1992, they're both the same city, you know? They're both two poles of the same city living this tension and this conflict and contradictions. And so let's see what happens in 25 more years.